In the winter of 1867, a new country was born on paper. But in the bedrooms and back alleys of that country, an old world still ruled with an iron fist. What if I told you that for the first 100 years of Canada's existence, the law could send you to prison for who you loved, that doctors could sterilize you against your will simply for being considered unfit to reproduce, and that a single word about birth control printed in a newspaper could get you arrested? By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how Canada went from a nation that criminalized desire itself to one of the first countries on earth to legalize same-sex marriage. And the story in between is stranger, darker, and more surprising than most history classes ever dared to teach. This is the story of Canadian sexuality from Confederation in 1867 to today. And it is not just a story about laws, it is a story about power, about who got to decide what was normal, and about the ordinary people who quietly, and sometimes loudly, refused to accept the rules they were handed. We are going to move decade by decade, and I promise you, some of what you are about to hear will genuinely shock you, especially what happened in the middle of this story, so stay with me. When Canada became a country in 1867, it inherited British criminal law almost wholesale, and that meant Victorian morality was baked directly into the legal code. Sodomy was a capital offense on the books, technically punishable by death, though by this point, executions for it were rare. The threat alone was enough to keep people terrified into silence. Sex outside of marriage was treated as a moral failing worthy of public shame, and women in particular were policed constantly. Their reputations were currency, and a rumor could destroy a life. The ideal Victorian Canadian woman was expected to be sexually passive, modest to the point of near invisibility, and entirely devoted to reproduction within marriage. Meanwhile, working-class women, especially in growing cities like Toronto and Montreal, were often driven into sex work simply to survive. And when they were caught, it was the women who were arrested and shamed, almost never the men who paid them. Indigenous peoples across what is now Canada had, before European contact, an enormous range of understandings around gender and sexuality, including recognized roles for people we would today call two-spirit, individuals who embodied both masculine and feminine spirits and often held respected positions within their communities. Colonization violently erased much of this. Christian missionaries and government policy worked together to impose rigid European gender norms onto Indigenous communities. And the residential school system, which began expanding rapidly in this era, became a site of devastating sexual abuse that would echo through generations. This is a part of the story that Canadian history books stayed silent on for over a century, and it matters enormously to understanding how sexuality in this country was never just about personal choice. It was tangled up with race, religion, and control from the very beginning. Now here is where things get genuinely disturbing, because what happened next in Canada was not just moral policing. It became a matter of national policy backed by science itself, or at least what passed for science at the time. By the early 20th century, a movement called eugenics had swept across North America, and Canada embraced it with frightening enthusiasm. The idea was simple and monstrous, that certain people were biologically unfit to reproduce, and the state had a duty to prevent them from doing so. Alberta passed the Sexual Sterilization Act in 1928, and British Columbia followed in 1933. Under these laws, thousands of people, disproportionately Indigenous women, poor women, unmarried mothers, and people labeled as mentally unfit were sterilized, often without their informed consent, sometimes without their knowledge at all. Some women went in for what they were told was a routine procedure and came out permanently unable to have children, discovering the truth only years later. Alberta's law remained in effect until 1972, meaning this was not some distant Victorian horror. It continued into the lifetimes of people who are still alive today. Leilani Moore, one survivor, later sued the Alberta government and won, exposing the full horror of the program to the Canadian public in the 1990s, decades after it had already destroyed countless lives. At the same time this was happening, information about sex itself was being aggressively suppressed. Under Section 207 of the Criminal Code, distributing information about birth control or contraception was a criminal offense, treated in the same category as obscenity. This created an almost absurd contradiction at the heart of Canadian policy. The state was willing to forcibly sterilize people it deemed unfit, while simultaneously making it illegal for anyone else to access voluntary birth control information to plan their own families responsibly. The activist Dorothea Palmer became a test case in 1936 when she was arrested in Eastview, Ontario for distributing birth control pamphlets to poor families. Her trial became a sensation, and remarkably, she was acquitted, the judge ruling that her actions served the public good. But the law itself remained on the books for decades more, and doctors and activists who continued the work still risked prosecution. Popular culture in this era reinforced everything the law was already enforcing. Advice columns, church sermons, and even school textbooks painted a single acceptable path for sexuality: marriage first, children after, and anything outside that narrow lane treated as a scandal or a sickness. Doctors of the period frequently pathologized any deviation from strict heterosexual monogamy, describing it in clinical language borrowed directly from European psychiatry, language that treated homosexuality, premarital sex, and even simple female desire as symptoms to be cured rather than parts of ordinary human life. Newspapers covered divorce cases and so-called moral scandals with lurid detail, turning private lives into public spectacles, meant to warn readers away from stepping out of line. Immigration policy of the era added another layer of control entirely. Officials at ports of entry were empowered to turn away or deport people, suspected of what the law vaguely termed moral turpitude, a category broad enough to include unmarried pregnant women, suspected sex workers, and anyone whose sexuality did not fit the approved mold. All of this combined to create a society where silence was not just encouraged, it was legally and socially enforced from childhood onward. If you think the early 20th century was repressive, wait until you hear what the Canadian government was secretly doing to its own public servants just a few decades later, because this next part of the story involves spies, lie detectors, and a purge that most Canadians have never even heard of. The period after the Second World War is often remembered as an era of prosperity and conformity, white picket fences and nuclear families, but underneath that shiny surface, the Canadian state was conducting one of the most extensive surveillance campaigns against its own citizens' sex lives in the country's history. Beginning in the 1950s and intensifying through the 1960s, the federal government, working with the RCMP, launched what became known as the Gay Purge. Fearing that homosexuality made civil servants, diplomats, and military personnel vulnerable to blackmail by Soviet agents during the Cold War, the government systematically hunted for gay and lesbian employees. They even developed a bizarre pseudoscientific device nicknamed the fruit machine, which claimed to detect homosexuality by measuring pupil dilation while subjects viewed explicit images. It never actually worked as intended, but it was used anyway, and thousands of Canadians lost their jobs, their careers, and in many cases their entire lives were destroyed simply because of who they loved. This campaign continued in various forms into the 1990s, and the federal government did not formally apologize and offer compensation to survivors until 2017, when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau stood in the House of Commons and acknowledged this dark chapter directly. But even as the state was hunting gay Canadians in secret, the ground was beginning to shift beneath everyone's feet. The 1960s brought the birth control pill to Canada, and even though distributing contraceptive information technically remained illegal until 1969, doctors increasingly prescribed the pill under the table for menstrual regulation, a wink and nod loophole that millions of women took advantage of. This single small pill did more to change the sexual lives of ordinary Canadians than perhaps any law or court case of the century, because for the first time, women could reliably separate sex from pregnancy, and that changed everything about relationships, careers, and independence. Alongside the secret purges, the broader sexual revolution sweeping through the United States and Europe in the 1960s did not skip over Canada. It simply arrived through a narrower door. University campuses became hotbeds of changing attitudes, with student newspapers openly debating premarital sex, feminism, and the hypocrisy of laws that punished women far more harshly than men for identical behavior. The feminist movement gaining momentum through this decade connected sexual freedom directly to broader questions of bodily autonomy, arguing that a woman who could not control her own reproduction could never truly control her own life. Meanwhile, the folk and counterculture movements imported American ideas about free love and personal liberation into Canadian cities, even as mainstream society and mainstream politics remained deeply cautious, creating a widening generational gap between parents who had grown up under strict Victorian inherited norms and children coming of age in a rapidly changing decade. And then, in 1969, everything changed at once, in a single piece of legislation that a young justice minister pushed through Parliament with one unforgettable line that Canadians still quote to this day. Pierre Trudeau, then Justice Minister, and soon to be Prime Minister, introduced sweeping reforms to the criminal code that decriminalized homosexual acts between consenting adults in private, and legalized the distribution of contraceptive information nationwide. Defending the bill, he told reporters that there was no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation, a phrase that instantly became one of the most famous sentences in Canadian political history. It is important to understand what this bill did and did not do. It decriminalized private acts between two consenting adults over the age of 21, but it did not grant equality. Gay Canadians could still be fired from their jobs, denied housing, and refused service openly and legally for years afterward. Still, it was a seismic shift, the first time the Canadian government had publicly stepped back from criminalizing private sexual behavior, and it opened the door for an entire generation of activism that followed close behind. The 1970s saw the first pride marches in Canadian cities, small, defiant, and often dangerous for the people who showed up. In February 1981, Toronto police raided 4 gay bathhouses simultaneously in what became known as Operation Soap, arresting nearly 300 men in the largest mass arrest in Canada since the October crisis. The raids were meant to intimidate the gay community into silence, but they backfired spectacularly, sparking massive protests in the streets of Toronto that many historians now consider the true birth of the modern Canadian Pride movement, Canada's own version of the Stonewall Uprising in the United States. What the police intended as a crushing blow became instead a rallying cry. The 1970s were not only about pride marches, they were also the decade when Canadian courts and legislatures began quietly wrestling with reproductive rights in ways that would matter enormously for the next 50 years. Abortion had been partially decriminalized in 1969 alongside the broader criminal code reforms, but only under a restrictive system requiring approval from a hospital therapeutic abortion committee, a process that left access wildly uneven across the country, with women in rural or conservative regions often forced to travel enormous distances or leave the country entirely. Dr. Henry Morgentaler became the central figure challenging this system, opening independent clinics in direct defiance of the law, facing arrest and trial multiple times through the 1970s and 1980s, becoming one of the most polarizing and consequential figures in the entire story of Canadian sexuality. His case would eventually reach the Supreme Court, but that showdown was still years away, and in the meantime, thousands of women navigated a patchwork system that treated reproductive control as a privilege to be granted by committee rather than a basic right. Then came a crisis that would devastate an entire generation and force the country to confront sexuality, stigma, and death all at once, and how Canada responded to it says everything about the deep prejudices that were still simmering just below the surface. The AIDS epidemic arrived in Canada in the early 1980s, and it hit the gay community with devastating force. Government response was slow, underfunded, and shaped heavily by homophobic assumptions about who deserved help and who did not. Thousands of Canadians died, many abandoned by families ashamed of both their sexuality and their diagnosis, cared for instead by chosen family, friends, and grassroots organizations that sprang up because no one else would help. Activist groups fought tirelessly for research funding, for compassion, and simply for the dignity of dying patients to be respected. Out of this immense tragedy came some of the strongest LGBTQ organizing Canada had ever seen. Because when the state failed people so completely, communities learned they had to build support systems entirely on their own, and those systems became the backbone of the rights movements that followed. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, legal walls began falling one after another. In 1995, sexual orientation was read into the Canadian Human Rights Act as a prohibited ground of discrimination following a Supreme Court ruling, meaning it finally became illegal nationwide to fire someone or deny them housing simply for being gay. Provinces began extending spousal benefits to same-sex couples through the late 1990s. Momentum was building towards something much bigger, something that would place Canada among a tiny handful of countries anywhere in the world at the very front of a global civil rights movement. Dr. Morgentaler's fight finally reached its climax in 1988, when the Supreme Court of Canada struck down the country's abortion law entirely in the landmark Morgentaler decision, ruling that the therapeutic abortion committee system violated a woman's constitutional right to security of the person under the newly entrenched Charter of Rights and Freedoms. For the first time in Canadian history, there was no federal criminal law restricting abortion at all, a status that remains unique among developed nations to this day. Since Parliament has never successfully passed replacement legislation despite repeated attempts, this ruling reshaped the entire landscape of reproductive rights in Canada almost overnight, and it stands as one of the clearest examples in this entire story of how a handful of determined individuals, one doctor and the lawyers who backed him, managed to overturn a century of state control in a single afternoon in a courtroom. And in 2005, Canada did something that shocked conservatives at home and made headlines across the entire planet, becoming only the 4th country in the world to do it. The Civil Marriage Act passed in July 2005, making Canada the 4th nation on Earth and the first outside Europe to legalize same-sex marriage nationwide. It followed a wave of provincial court rulings, beginning in Ontario in 2003, that had already started allowing same-sex couples to marry province by province until the federal government finally caught up and made it the law of the land from coast to coast to coast. This was not a quiet, uncontested change. The parliamentary debate was fierce, religious organizations lobbied hard against it, and public opinion was genuinely divided. But the law passed, and Canada's global reputation as a progressive haven for LGBTQ rights was cemented in that single vote. While these battles over orientation were unfolding, a quieter but equally important shift was happening around gender identity, sex education, and consent, one that continues to shape headlines and heated debates in this country right up to the present day. The 2000s and 2010s brought new frontiers entirely. Trans rights moved to the center of the conversation, with Bill C-16 passing in 2017 to add gender identity and gender expression as protected grounds under federal human rights law. Sex education curricula became fierce political battlegrounds, particularly in Ontario, where a 2015 update to the health curriculum sparked protests from some parent groups while being celebrated by public health experts as long overdue modernization covering consent, online safety, and gender diversity for a generation growing up entirely online. The Me Too movement, arriving in Canada in 2017, forced a national reckoning around consent, sexual harassment, and the abuse of power, toppling prominent media figures, politicians, and institutions, and prompting Canadian universities and workplaces to rewrite their policies almost overnight. Indigenous communities, meanwhile, continued pushing for recognition of two-spirit identities and for justice regarding the ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, a crisis directly rooted in the same colonial violence that shaped sexuality and gender in this country from the very beginning. Social media reshaped this landscape yet again through the late 2010s and into the 2020s, giving young Canadians unprecedented access to information about identity, orientation, and relationships, while simultaneously exposing them to new forms of harm entirely unknown to earlier generations, including online exploitation, non-consensual image sharing, and algorithm-driven misinformation about bodies and consent. Provinces responded unevenly, some expanding digital literacy and consent education, others pulling back on curriculum in response to political pressure, ensuring that a teenager's experience of sex education in one province could look completely different from a teenager's experience just across a provincial border. Meanwhile, the conversation around gender identity accelerated further, with growing numbers of young Canadians identifying outside the traditional binary altogether, prompting institutions from schools to hospitals to workplaces to rethink policies that had been built assuming only two categories existed. So where does this leave Canada today, in 2026, nearly 160 years after Confederation? And does the story I promised you at the start finally come full circle? Today, Canadian law protects sexual orientation and gender identity at the federal level. Same-sex marriage remains fully legal, and public attitudes have transformed almost unrecognizably from where this story began. Surveys now consistently show a strong majority of Canadians supporting LGBTQ rights, a stunning reversal from a country that once ran secret purges against its own citizens. Yet the story is not simply one of triumphant progress in a straight line. Trans rights remain fiercely contested in political debates and provincial legislatures. Sex education policy continues to shift with changing governments. Indigenous communities are still fighting for full acknowledgement and repair regarding the sexual violence embedded in residential schools and the sterilization programs that targeted their mothers and grandmothers. And new challenges around consent, online exploitation, and digital privacy are rewriting the rules yet again for an entirely new generation navigating relationships in a world the framers of the 1969 reforms could never have imagined. The history of Canadian sexuality is really the history of Canada arguing with itself about power, about who counts as normal, and about how much control the state should have over the most private parts of our lives. From a country that could imprison you for loving the wrong person, to one that legalized marriage for that same love, Canada's journey was never simple, never fully finished, and never guaranteed. It was built by ordinary people who refused to stay silent, by court cases that took decades to win, and by a society that had to be dragged, argument by argument, generation by generation, towards something resembling justice. And if this story taught you anything, it is that the rights we take for granted today were never inevitable. They were fought for, one uncomfortable, courageous step at a time.